Looking back on the week that was and forward to the week ahead. It's the Fantasy Football Hustle. Here are your hosts, Brian Drake and Dwain McFarland.
All across the fantasy universe, this is the Fantasy Football Hustle, powered by Pro Football Focus. I'm Brian Drake. FightingChanceFantasy.com is where you find me. Joined as always, and especially on this early morning Memorial Day weekend edition, it's my good pal, the analytical assassin, Dwain McFarland of Pro Football Focus. Dwain, how are you, my friend?
Man, I'm doing good. It's fun to wake up and do a Saturday morning. Anytime you get to talk about fantasy football, Drake, or just football in general. Yeah, I'm excited.
It's always exciting to talk fantasy football because everybody's into fantasy. You know, you're into it. Your home league's into it. Your office league's into it. You're playing DFS. You're playing online with people you don't know. Even professional athletes, Dwain, play fantasy football. And we have to quickly touch on this story from Major League Baseball where Jock Peterson of the San Francisco Giants and Tommy Pham, who I don't even know who that is. That could be a made-up name. Tommy Pham of the Cincinnati Reds got into an argument on the field before a Major League Baseball game, and Tommy Pham slapped Jock Peterson over this issue. Jock Peterson in the clubhouse was interviewed. I can't believe this is a real thing, and told reporters that he had a player in a fantasy league that was listed as out. He put him on the IR spot, and that created a hellstorm in the group chat, which we've all been a part of, where Tommy Pham then calls him a cheater and he should be out of the league. There's screenshots going back and forth where Jock says, you had the exact same thing going on your team with Jeff Wilson Jr. of all people. So I've put out the call to Tommy Pham and Jock Peterson. You can come on the Fantasy Football Hustle and talk to us about this. But man, can you believe this? This spilled over onto a field in the MLB where guys are now slapping each other over IR spots.
Yeah, people are serious about fantasy football. I think that's what it tells us. Maybe too serious. Everybody's probably, if you play fantasy football long enough, you've been part of something like that. Maybe not necessarily, with the apex moment being a slap, right, on a Major League Baseball field. But yeah, look, people get into it, man. And I think when you spend so much time consuming content, around fantasy football, creating content around fantasy football, researching things for fantasy football, people get invested.
Yeah, they do. I know I actually have this exact rule in the home league that I am the commissioner of. So I know exactly what these guys speak of. And it is an issue because guys do try to sneak players onto their IR. So I see both sides of this. I don't condone any violence, but sometimes you have to make a point. So guys, come on the show and talk with Dwain and I. That'd be a lot of fun. We're so glad you guys are hanging with us here. Again, it's Memorial Day weekend. So I hope you guys are all enjoying yourself whenever you consume this show, be it Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, whatever it is. We got a fun one for you today. What we're going to do is take an article that Dwain did over at pff.com, and we're going to break down how to identify breakout wide receiver candidates. Everybody out there is trying to tell you, I've got the metrics. I know I've got dominator scores and breakout ages and year 3 breakouts. And everybody's got an idea here. Dwain did some really great research, and I want you guys all to go to pff.com and check it out. The article's free right now. It's linked in the show notes. And if you love that kind of
it's
stuff,
not free anymore. Drake. They put this one behind premium, but you get the hustle here for you. But still go check it out. Still go get it. A lot of
we can save them 25% too.
We can, and you do need a sub. So
see, I've got the subscription here at PFF, so I easily walk into it. But yes, if you want to go read this article now, you got to use promo code HUSTLE. Save 25%. Go read the locked article, and this is a really good one. We're not going to give you every player that Dwain thinks is set up for a breakout, but we'll give you a few. If you want the rest of those juicy nuggets, man, you got to go there. Use promo code HUSTLE. Save 25%. Trust me. Get the data. Win your damn league. All right? We're going to put that on a T-shirt at some point. So we appreciate PFF, especially for all the good stuff they do for us there. So first and foremost, Dwain, how did you get the idea for this concept, this article? How did you put together the metrics? Like, kind of give us the brainstorm here behind the article.
Well, part of it is like we're really trying to work on some different things behind the scenes at PFF. And so I was just thinking through a lot of the things that get thrown around, like terms that get thrown around in fantasy football. Was chatting through it with Ian and some of the other folks over at PFF, and like breakout, right? Like that's a big one. Sleepers, busts, and just really trying to go back and take a look at each one of these things by position. Because I have my preconceived ideas based on research I've done in the past, based off of research that I've read from others, and some of it really good. So I think there was a lot. Not everything I'm going to share today is exactly going to be groundbreaking. Some of it will just be reaffirming, right? Things that you may have already read, but then adding in little layers of other things. So I'm really kind of on this path of wanting to make sure that, when we say breakout, or when we say, a potential bus player, all these sort of things, like, okay, what does the data really say about what do these players look like, and is there something we can use to help identify them? There may not always be. So it's just about going on that journey. And because I've been working through my tier process, a lot of this stuff and these ideas that I'd already had that I've used in the past were kind of baked into the way I built my tiers. So it's just another opportunity for me to even test those further and say, should I even be thinking about them, a little bit different? And mainly really around the edges of player outcomes is where I was, trying to go. Make sure that I'm really thinking of their ceiling and their floor in the right way. So this research all plays right into that. So it's kind of it's me going through the journey of getting rankings and tiers and everything done, and just trying to think through, like, okay, what are the things people care about, in fantasy football, and what's the research that's out there? What could we potentially add? What could be things that maybe haven't been looked at before, and can we implement or can we integrate those, right, or assimilate into things that we've already known?
And I always say that people want the magic bullet. We sometimes beat people over the head in fantasy with different takes and numbers and theories, but really people just want to know, who the hell should I draft? Dwayne, you're a smart guy. Drake, you're an idiot, but you got a podcast. Like, just tell me, who am I drafting here? All right. So what Dwayne did is he used data going back to 2011. And the goal of this article is threefold. And I'm stealing this right from the article. Number one, identify when receivers typically break out based on their experience. Number two, understand the data points that often precede production leaps. And finally, apply our learnings from the first two data points to identify potential breakouts for 2022. So let's kind of walk through this article here and the methodology of how you came up with these guys. So when you're talking about a wide receiver 1 or a wide receiver 2 threshold, for the first time in their career, that's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about guys who do it every single year. We're talking about, we want to find guys who are doing it for the first time, right, Dwayne? A top 12, top 24 finish.
Yeah. And so the idea of breakout, a lot of times in the research I've read, is basically, do you have a top 24 finish, which I think is also fair. If you were just to pick one cutoff for what a breakout looks like, that's probably what it would be. But as I was just digging into the data, what I tried to do when I created the thresholds for where wide, and this will be based on PPR 12-team leagues, so we would have to make slight adjustments for like a 10-team half PPR, right? It'll look a little bit different, but a lot of the underlying stuff is going to be really similar. It doesn't change that much for a lot of these players. The biggest difference is PPR to standard. But I went back and I looked from 2011, like you mentioned. And so what has been the average score for the wide receiver 12? How many fantasy points have they scored since 2011? Then for the wide receiver 11, wide receiver 10, 9, 8, so on. Every wide receiver slot I've basically, and I've done it for points per game as well. But right now, I'll just give you the raw fantasy points. So the cutoff for being a wide receiver 1 is 263. And there's a couple things that made me want to go ahead and make wide receiver 1 its own. And that was because when you really look at the high end range of points for a wide receiver 1 versus the low end range of points for a wide receiver 2, there's a big difference. 330 points for the average top 6 scores at fantasy wide receiver. You take the bottom 6 in the wide receiver 2 tier, so 18 to 24, it's only 223 points. That's a 100-point difference. So if you make a leap from that to 330, that's another breakout in my opinion. So what I really wanted to do was break down anyone that hadn't been a wide receiver 1 before, anyone that hadn't been a wide receiver 2 before. Now, caveat here, if you've already been a wide receiver 1 and you were never a wide receiver 2, I'm not going to count that. Meaning, basically, you've already crossed the threshold. You just skipped past wide receiver 2. So that's why I really wanted to split it up and look at wide receiver 1s and wide receiver 2s. Because, again, at the end of the day, what are we trying to do? We're trying to take players that may be going a certain range based on ADP. When we need to make sure we're really thinking about their ceiling outcomes, and doing that, for example, a guy like DJ Moore, yeah, we got a bad quarterback situation with Sam Darnold. We've talked about that on the wide receiver tier show. It's very scary when you look at a lot of guys that are in that tier. But at the end of the day, like DJ Moore, with as many wide receiver 2 and 3 seasons as he's already had, he's probably going to have a wide receiver 1 season. Like it's gonna happen at some point. And a lot of times these things just come from a fluky big efficiency year. But if you're good enough for long enough, right, luck can eventually play into the equation for you. And DJ Moore's a player that's got that going for him. The other thing I would say, the reason I use these benchmarks, Drake, was because a lot of times you may have a down wide receiver season. And what I didn't want to do was just say, okay, based on that year, you were a wide receiver 3. You may have been or a wide receiver 2. You may have been a wide receiver 2 in 2018, but if you didn't cross the 215-point barrier to get to wide receiver 2, I don't count that. I count that as you were still a wide receiver 3. You just kind of got lucky, and it was a bad year for receivers. Maybe a bunch of people got hurt. Who knows what happened? The ball got spread around more. Just weird crap happens, right? We talk about that all the time. I wanted to really create more of a consistent benchmark, and then the next thing I did on top of that is I went back and I looked at, okay, for these types of players that finish in these ranges, also like what was their average yards per route run? What was their average targets per route run? What were their average, PFF receiving grade? And these are things that I've done in the past, but now I was tying it all together, like looking at the previous finishes, looking at that data together, because what I wanted to do was find out if a player hadn't finished already as at least a wide receiver 3, were there other leading indicators that may have been able to tell us, they hadn't had a wide receiver 3 finish yet, but their PFF receiving grade was already a wide receiver 3, or was already a wide receiver 2, and their yards per route run has already been a wide receiver 3, right, in the previous year. And so we'll talk about some examples of those later. There's a lot of really cool ones where, and these are guys that, the community's often off on, and that's where you can get, there's not as many of them. I'll be honest with you guys. Most players that break out into wide receiver 1 have already been a wide receiver 2 before. Spoiler alert, like it, or a wide receiver 3 at least. But usually the community's on them, right? So it's already baked into their ADP. So it's hard for us to extract, a ton of value from that. Now, if it hits, like we can still get value, but where the real value comes is are the players that everybody's just basically off of for whatever reason or another, but their underlying data points are still telling us, they still have a chance, right, to be a wide receiver 1. And so we'll get into some of those.
And we talked about some of those in our pre-show notes. And there was a guy we're going to talk about. I dismissed. I go, nobody cares about this guy, Dwain. We don't have to talk about him. And Dwayne's like, that's the reason we're doing the show. He's like, this is the perfect guy to talk about. So it'll be great when we get there. So when do players break out, basically? And we've got some stuff here. Do you want me to share your screen? We can add this to the stream. Yeah. And if you guys are watching on YouTube, you're definitely going to want to always get over to Fantasy Football Hustle on YouTube. We've got some great data visualization that Dwain comes up with. We had such good feedback from our wide receiver tier show that you're going to want to get on YouTube. You're going to want to see this. Put it up on your TV in your living room while you're drinking this weekend. So you're really going to want to see this because, according to your tiers, Dwain, for example, 85% of wide receiver 1 performances over the last 11 years have come from 2nd to 8-year receivers. So we're looking at guys here, unless you broke out really well year 1 and you were just a superstar, it's never going to happen for old guys either. If you're some guy 6, 7, 8 years down the line, it's like, I don't think we're going to really get on that. So let's look at your tiers here. Let's look at your graph. Kind of explain this to the people. Wide receiver PPR finishes by experience from 2011 to 2021.
Yeah, so all this is doing is we're looking at what percentage of wide receiver 1s. So for example, like if you look, I remember certain people are just listening to this, Drake. So yes. Like I want to make sure that I'm explaining it well on the podcast. So yeah, for wide receiver 1s, 11% of them since 2011 through 2021 across all of these seasons, 11% of them have been year 2 receivers, right? 16% of them have been year 3 receivers. So I'm not going to go across and name every one of these percentages, but you kind of already hit the first part. And remember, this is for all receivers that were playing between 11 and 21. I didn't care when their career started. I didn't care when, their careers ended. It didn't matter. Just were they in the receiver pool? And then just looking back at these thresholds and saying, okay, what percentage of the makeup of wide receiver 1s was year 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 players all the way up to year 12, right? And you've kind of already hit it on the head. The big part is 85% of these performances over the last 11 seasons, come from year 2, right, out to year 8. But like if you really look at it, like the biggest portion of it, 68% comes between years 2 and year 6. So again, this isn't saying breakouts. This is just saying, okay, what was the experience, right, for wide receiver ones? And so what it does tell us, though, is that those are going to be the main years that we're looking at. Yeah, you can get some production, wide receiver 1 production out in the tail end. Like we've had 2% of wide receiver ones have had an experience, of 12 years, 11 years, 10 years. Each one of those buckets has 2%. But again, you get survivor bias in there, right? It's a lot of times the same awesome receiver that's still playing because they're older and they're the one that's, or it's one of these guys like that. It's a rotation of like an Andre Johnson and a Brandon Marshall, like they're making up that pool. But for wide receiver 2, it's a little bit different, like I would say years 2 to 7, so for wide receiver 1, the primary years, if we were making a cutoff at like 10% or more of the pool, years 2 to year 6, wide receiver 2s would be years 2 through year 7, and then wide receiver 3, years 1 through year 4, right? Which is interesting. Now you can still be a wide receiver 3 longer, like we see more of them out in years 9 and 10, which makes sense because the thresholds for points are less. But most of those that you see in those outer years are former wide receiver 1s and 2s that are just tailing off, right? But they're still in the league. And so the primary takeaway here, right, is really like years 2 to 6 are the most important years whenever we're thinking about when is the pool robust, right? When do we know we're going to have a lot of wide receiver 1 performances, just based on the experience archetype, kind of not the archetype, but the arc, right, for the player's career.
Where this brings me to kind of spin it to the average player that might be listening for their home league. If you're in your draft and you're looking at the board and you're saying like, oh, wow, like AJ Green's on the board right now. And I know he's been a really good player. And he's there. Well, who else is around, his ADP? And you're like, well, I don't know. Let me pull somebody up here. Here's AJ Green. So he's wide receiver 83. You're in the back end of a draft. Who's around him? Braxton Berrios.
Just go Braxton Berrios. Yeah. I would take Braxton Berrios over AJ Green.
Yeah, Tim Patrick.
Do we think AJ
Alec
Green
Pierce
probably has a better path to playing? Maybe this year. But once you get that late in your draft, like Braxton Berrios has actually flashed certain things in his underlying profile. So that's a great example. Like AJ Green versus Braxton Berrios. I think a lot of people would say AJ Green because they think he's going to start.
Right. And we always hear this time of year, everyone's talking about upside and how do I win with upside? And, who can I find to be the next great guy? It's not like there's some secret formula here. Like we're kind of breaking it down for you. If you just do the math and put some common sense behind it, like, hey, draft guys who are in their prime years. Like, hey guys, when you're going to the bar to, pick up some chicks, you're not looking at the girls who are on, 45 plus. You're looking at the girls, in this category here who are, 21 to 28. So think of it in that regards here. If you want to get real Neanderthal about it. So just pick good players who are young, who are ascending talents. All right. So now you're pulling up first time threshold breakouts on the screen. What's this all about? Nope. I think you're muted.
Yeah. Previously I've never had a mute button before. Now that this mic I do. So, and I forget about it. My bad. But yeah, so what we just talked about was looking across all players, right? Just saying, okay, look, basically what's the makeup of a wide receiver 1 based on experience? And we've covered that. But what we really want to know is looking at these players when they first had that breakout that we're talking about, becoming a wide receiver or wide receiver 2, what do those percentages look like? Because what we're trying to figure out is like, how often do players break out actually? How often does that year 6 receiver really, is that the breakout year, right? For a wide receiver 1 or a wide receiver 2, performance. So what I did is I just quickly broke down by experience and by these buckets, wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3, what percentage of the players at experience year 2 that were wide receiver 1s, what percentage of them were first time wide receiver 1s? 78%. That makes sense though, because you've only been a rookie, right? You were a rookie. Now you're in your second year. So 78% of those year 2 players that had a wide receiver 1 season, it was their first time to do that. That's not surprising really, like at all. But what is surprising for wide receiver 1s, now the further you get away from year 2 and year 3, the raw number of players we're talking about here gets smaller and smaller, right? And it makes sense because like as players mature, they become less likely to break out. They also they could leave the league. So now the pool of players we have is getting smaller and smaller, but the percentages don't really, drop off too much for wide receiver one. You can see year 3 players, 82% of them, it was their first time to be a wide receiver one. Year 4 players that were in the wide receiver one bucket, 66% of them, it was their first time. Year 5, 40%, still not even half, but that's a lot in year 5. And then in year 6, 60% of the first time, 60% of the wide receiver ones, it was their first time in year 6. But then it just like all goes away. Year 7, 8, 9, and 10, 0% of the time was it the player's first time to be a wide receiver one. Wide receiver 2 is a little different. 86% of the year 2 players, it was their first time to be a wide receiver 2. For year 3, 50%, but then it drops off to 22%, 36%, and 20%. So basically 1 in 5, kind of opportunity that it was really their first time to be a wide receiver 2. Most of them had already had been a wide receiver 3 before. And then wide receiver 3 is pretty similar to wide receiver 2. I won't name off all the data points, but one other way to look at it is if you just want to, put it together like top 24, top 36. And if you do that, really it's year 2 and year 3 where you get the big jumps for that wide receiver 1 or 2 when you combine all that data together. 81% of the time it was a player's first time to be a wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2 in year 2. And then for year 3, 82% of the time it was their first time to be in the top 24. So this is just telling us that and it makes sense, right? Much more likely early on, right, that it's their first time to do this. But for wide receiver ones, it can actually happen, out to years 4, 5, and 6. And we've seen some good examples of these.
Yeah, we're going to talk about some guys in a moment here because, folks, I mean, just look at these numbers. It smacks you right in the face. You want to be buying in on these 2nd and 3rd year wide receivers because that is where the jump is going to come from. These are the guys who are going to finish as wide receivers 1s and 2s in the league. These are guys who are going to help you win your fantasy league. If you're going to take a shot somewhere in your draft, do it on this young emerging talent. How about repeat threshold performers? I don't know how much time you want to spend on this.
No, we don't have to. All that's doing, it's an inverse of the data we just talked about, right? So if we talked about how often it was really a player's first time, what you start to look at, is what percentage of these were really just, repeat. So it's a lot of these players are repeating. A lot of these players, once you become a wide receiver 1, you will eventually be a wide receiver 1 again. It may not happen every year consistently, year over year. But I mean, the main takeaway is most top 24 performers, they've been there before once you get to year 4, like what you were just talking about. Year 2 and 3 is really hyperactive. And there are players that can still do it later. And we're going to talk about what those look like. And there's several guys on the list for this year that are going into year 6 that have never had that wide receiver 1 finish, but hit a lot of the key criteria. But the main takeaway is the fact that once you get to year 4, 83% of the top 24 wide receivers have already been there before.
And people could say, well, okay, that's great. You're looking at previous seasons and all that, but what other metrics are you putting in? And this is where I thought you did something really cool, is you combined the PFF receiving grades, you put yards per route run, and you also layered in targets per route run. And that brought you to some real big takeaways, like, previous fantasy finishes are the easiest way to find future wide receiver 1s and 2s, obviously. But shifting through those advanced metrics, you helped really identify some guys who people might have been overlooking in drafts who became fantasy stalwarts.
Yeah, and I think the big part of this goes back to what we talked about, the wide receiver 1 threshold breakouts, and how you still have 60% of the wide receiver 1 pool in year 6 with players, that were there for the first time. So I mean, that tells us that the wide receiver 1 spot, that we can get these later breakouts. And so we really just want to understand what might be the leading indicators for them, to get to that point. And so a lot of times whenever we're looking at it, if they don't have that wide receiver 2 or wide receiver 3 finish to really kind of tip us off as to what may happen later in their career. And that's the easiest way. Like you said, if you don't have a lot of time to prepare and you just want to know who has the best chance of breaking out as a wide receiver 1, just go look at the players that have already got wide receiver 2 and 3 finishes. But we do have this group of players that have never been even a wide receiver 3 before, and they're breaking out all of a sudden as a wide receiver 1, right? And so that's really what this was about. It's about, okay, well, what might be some of the other leading indicators that would tell us, even though they haven't done that, like they've already flashed, in PFF receiving grade. They've already flashed in targets per route run or yards per route run. And a lot of times they've already flashed like in all three. And so this is just a quick visual of what does a wide receiver one look like on average. So if you just average across the top 12 wide receivers since 2011, that's 303 PPR points per game. But if you look at yards per route run, wide receiver ones in PPR have had a 2.28 yards per route run, a 25% targets per route run, and an 84.9 PFF receiving grade. And then I just did the same thing for wide receiver twos, yards per route run 1.97, targets per route run 22%, PFF receiving grade 73.9. And then so those are the main two. I won't read the rest of them, but it's done for wide receiver threes, fours, and fives. And so what that does is I can go and I can look at a player. I can look at all the breakouts and I can basically look in the past to see, did they hit any of these leading metrics? And then if we had accounted for that, like then what would have been, our hit rate? How many of these players that we couldn't identify by wide receiver 2 or wide receiver 3 performances, could we have identified additionally? And so, for example, players that went on to have a wide receiver 1 season that hadn't had a wide receiver 2 or a wide receiver 3 finish before, there were 6 from 2011 to 2021. 4 of them were identified by this process, right? So, I mean, you're down to only 2 players that we didn't have some sort of leading indicator that they were going to have a wide receiver 1 season. And then for wide receiver 2s, it actually ended up being 100% of these players that we were able to. Oh, that's wrong. Sorry. For the wide receiver 2s, we had 17 guys that didn't meet a wide receiver 3 threshold before turning into a wide receiver 2. And 10 of those, we actually had some sort of a metric across these 3 things that actually told us, or most of the time, like when it happened later in their career, I will say this, it had already happened multiple times for them. Like they had been like putting up underlying data points. And a lot of these players dealt with injuries, different things like that may have cut their routes short in a season. But it still showed that like underlying, like if they were to get enough playing time, they would have a really good shot at breaking out. So if you look at all of those, right, we talked about 6 wide receiver 1s, and we identified 4 additional. There were 17 wide receiver 2s that hadn't been a wide receiver 3 before, and we identified 10 additional of those. So it's like,
that's
you're
huge.
you're picking up like another 60% or whatever of the potential breakouts that haven't already had that wide receiver 3 season. So it doesn't sound like it's not a lot, like on a raw number, but we're looking for any edge that we can find in fantasy, right? And there's so much content, there's so much stuff out there. I would, if I can, anywhere I can find something like this where we know there's this data that actually suggests that, okay, like this actually matters, right? This can tell us more about a player, even if it means there's 1 receiver or 2 receivers a year, right? That it puts us on that we wouldn't have been on before, but they're like massive discounts at ADP. Like that's essentially what we're looking for.
I mean, just think of the guys who are grinding these edges. And in a Major League Baseball team, they're getting in fights over stashing players listed as out on injured reserve. So if you can actually find real tangible data that says, hey, let's pick this guy up. And I know there's a lot of folks out there.
Let's give some examples.
Yeah,
here's examples like that I think help people. Go ahead.
So, yeah, I was going to say there's a lot of guys out there, Dwayne, who they might not understand targets per route run and yards per route run, but this is why it matters. This is why we do this show, and we try to put it into layman's terms. So you can find a guy like, let's see, a year 2 guy, Allen Robinson. So he flashed his wide receiver 2 targets per route run as a rookie, 23%. Boom, he ascends. Talk about Cooper Kupp, because in year 3, he really exploded. It wasn't a guy who, nobody was on Cooper Kupp. You're going to draft Cooper Kupp right now in the top 5, probably in your PPR league. Cooper Kupp was not a, Justin Jefferson. He was not a Jamar Chase, not even close in his first few years. But talk about
his wide receiver 4s, his first 2 years.
Yeah, he's a wide receiver 4. So you're looking at eclipsing 75 on the receiving grade as a rookie. And he had a target or a yards per route run of 2.04. Then he managed a wide receiver 2 receiving grade and a yards per route run of 2.26 in his second year. So it was slowly building. So what Dwayne's doing here is showing you positive growth. It's showing you a guy like Doug Baldwin in year 5 who posted a really good receiving grade as a rookie, and his targets per route run were going up year over year. Here's the guy that I love, Dwayne. Robert Woods, year 6 big time breakout. We know he was kind of a wide receiver 3. He's one of those guys you get in the middle rounds. Wide receiver 3 in targets per route run in his 4th season. But you're looking at those
But he had never been a
rates.
wide receiver 3 before. He had never even been a fantasy wide receiver 3 before, but he had a wide receiver 3 targets per route run, right? So it's about, again, like the story, hasn't finished as a fantasy wide receiver 3 yet, but his targets per route run, we're already saying he was a wide receiver 3. His PFF receiving grade, you can go ahead and go through these, but they were already saying he was a wide receiver 2. Targets, so I mean, it's, and those were all in his 5th year. He had wide receiver 2 marks across the board in his 5th year, across targets per route run, yards per route run, and PFF receiving grade. So yeah, like the way you're summarizing it, like it's just all these guys didn't necessarily have that wide receiver 3 finish, but they had already had seasons on the books of where their underlying data points had already said they were actually better than a wide receiver 3. Every one of these guys you just mentioned, even though they didn't have a wide receiver 3 finish, their underlying data points said they were already wide receiver 2s.
So let's look at some guys for this year. People, that's why they're listening. Dwayne, Drake, tell me who to draft for 2022. Let's start with some second-year wide receivers. And a very polarizing guy here is Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions. So he finished last year. He was PPR wide receiver. He finished as a top 24 PPR wide receiver, averaged 13.4 PPR points per game, 119 targets last year, including double-digit looks each of the last 6 weeks. Now you got Hawkinson healthy. They did add Jameson Williams, DJ Chark, but I still like him a lot, Dwayne, because Goff is not going to push the ball down the field. I just tweeted out a stat I found. Lions only had 16 receptions last year of air yards of more than 20. Only 3 teams were worse than that. So he's a guy with your metrics that you say could break out and have one of these wide receiver 1 seasons. Why do you like him so much?
Well, I mean, you pretty much hit on it all. I mean, he's already had the wide receiver 2 finish. And if you look at his underlying data points, across the board, they're all good. So, I mean, the main thing, hitting that PFF receiving grade of an 80, right? And if folks haven't, you probably heard that episode, but if you haven't, you can go back and check that out. Drake and I recorded that one, I don't know, probably a couple months ago. And there's some research that I put out over on PFF as well around that. And so the hit rate on these guys eventually becoming wide receiver 1s or continuing on as wide receiver 2s is really good. And so Amon-Ra St. Brown, like targets per route run, 22%, target share of 19%, the PFF receiving grade we already talked about, yards per route run, 1.74. So he's backing up the fantasy finish that we've already seen. All of the underlying data points say that it was real, right? Yes, TJ Hawkinson was out. Yes, DeAndre Swift was out. But at the end of the day, like, you still have to be good enough to create some targets on your own. Otherwise, we would just see every time superstars go down, like somebody else would just step in and all of a sudden become awesome fantasy receivers. We don't see that. It's actually really rare that when a really good wide receiver goes down and his backup comes in, that we actually just see them explode. So those things are just all positive for Amon-Ra. And again, you mentioned earlier, like the high level takeaways, year 2 and year 3 guys, like we know that there's a lot more of them. Our pool is bigger to pick from, right? Because you have more players that, there's more unknowns about them, but Amon-Ra is just checking all the boxes.
A guy,
and he could be a wide receiver 1. That's the thing. Wide receiver 2, fine. He could finish he could still be a wide receiver 3. That's probably his floor. But wide receiver 1 is in his range of outcomes, for this season, based on what we've seen, right? Historically from other players that end up breaking out.
Somebody who the fantasy community is putting a lot of eggs in his basket is Rashad Bateman of the Baltimore Ravens. His underdog ADP is crept inside the top 60. He's wide receiver 28 over there on underdog right now. Hollywood Brown and his 146 targets there in Arizona. So left in Baltimore, it's Bateman, Dwayne, it's Mark Andrews, and a bag of stale donuts. I mean, there's nothing here. He can't come through. My God.
Yeah, I mean, and looking at Bateman, like he nearly didn't make the list, which I know is like, people are like, what? So again, this kind of, refers back to the data that I looked at earlier in the offseason around PFF rookie receiving grade. And then looking like, what does that really mean for a player? And so he did not make the cut into that first bucket that we really want to be in for a PFF receiving grade as a rookie. Like he was nowhere near Amon-Ra St. Brown, who was at an 80. He was just over 65, which puts him into the second group of players. And it's still a really good group of players. So like historically, we're talking about But listen, there are hits and misses here. DJ Moore, Denarius Moore, Jordan Matthews, Taylor Gabriel, Devin Funchess.
I had him on a couple teams.
Yeah,
I
did
was a Raider.
too. I did.
He was a
too.
Raider, right? Yeah.
Yeah. What's funny is when I went back and looked at this data, he never popped in the underlying stuff. It would have told me don't be on Denarius Moore. So that's the other thing. I haven't even got into the aspect of what this data will tell you to fade, right? I mean, so that's probably just needs to be a whole nother article. But like Devin Funchess, Devontae Parker, Jamison Crowder, Amari Cooper fits into this bucket. Like I'm just Christian Kirk, Mecole Hardman, DK Metcalf, though, in this bucket. DeAndre Hopkins was in this bucket. So what I did is looking at this, I was like, okay, let's take draft capital and put it together with this receiving grade and let's see what it means. And so 4 out of 10 first rounders that finished with a receiving grade between 65 and 74.9, which Bateman fits into, Julio Jones, Brandon Cooks, DeAndre Hopkins, Calvin Ridley, they all went on to find top 12 success in year 2 and 3. Amari Cooper, DJ Moore, Kendall Wright, Sammy Watkins, and Marquise Brown had one outing ranked between 13 and 24. So they became wide receiver 2s. So 9 out of 10 players who were first rounders that put up a PFF wide receiver grade in the range that Bateman barely made his way into. I mean, ever so slightly, Drake, by 0.1 percentage points. Bateman made it in there. But 9 out of 10 of those players went on to find their way into the top 24 in year 2 or year 3. So that's what got him onto the list. Like I said, it was really close for him, but also look, he was playing hurt last year. So those are things, there's still context that goes to all this stuff. Mm-hmm. And you already mentioned like what happens with Marquise Brown being gone. I do think the Ravens are going to run the ball more again now based on some of the moves we've seen. But at the same time, there's only 2 mouths to feed, and it's Mark Andrews and Bateman. We could still have a really nice season from Bateman.
You talked about first round draft capital, and Kadarius Toney in New York has that. And I know there's been a lot of talk. Hey, he's been available for trade. He's kind of a knucklehead. On Underdog, he is the first Giants wide receiver coming off the board. I mean, it's not great. He's wide receiver 53 coming off at pick 110, but still, and we'll get to another Giants player later, but people are kind of buying into Kadarius Toney.
They're actually his ADP has fallen like 3 rounds since the 2
but
rounds.
They should be buying it based on what you're saying.
So Wan'Dale Robinson was taken in the 2nd round by the Giants. There were rumors of Toney being traded. So there's rumors basically that does this coaching staff really buy into Kadarius Toney? We don't know. Yeah. And so I think those rumors combined with the fact of drafting Wan'Dale Robinson together are pushing Kadarius Toney down the board. Now, the beauty of Toney is all that stuff was already true. We just didn't have Wan'Dale Robinson, but we'd already heard stories that the coaching staff might not be in on Toney. So to me, this is just giving us an additional discount on Toney. What's funny is people aren't drafting Wan'Dale Robinson. So it seems like it's really the combo of the two things pushing Toney down. It's not necessarily making people want to jump on Wan'Dale, although that's a different topic. Wan'Dale is a great late round pick just because he was a 2nd rounder and people aren't treating him like that. But when you look at Kadarius Toney, here's the big thing. Small sample size, only 201 routes. The cutoff is 200 for me to actually even analyze your data. But a 2.09 yards per route run and a targets per route run of 26%, those are wide receiver 1 marks, basically. The targets per route run is a wide receiver 1 mark of 26%. Now, again, small sample size. The other signals we're getting from the Giants aren't great. But when you can get him in the 10th and 11th round, of an FFPC draft, also, I don't know where he's at right now on Underdog. I'm looking.
Who are you looking at?
Toney, as of yesterday, over on Underdog is actually 53. So, yeah, so you're still getting him in that range. You may have said that a second ago, so yeah. My bad. But Toney, the main thing is now the ADP on him is like getting into a range where you really want to take a shot on him. So different, right? A little bit of a different player than Bateman. Bateman barely made the cutoff, but we know that he's probably going to have a role. Toney, his role could be kind of up in the air as to what the Giants are really going to do with him, but underlying data points on the small sample size scream wide receiver 1.
Just as an aside on the New York Giants here. So now you bring in Brian Daboll to run this offense here. So you got Kenny Galladay, who we'll talk about in a minute, can never stay healthy. Kadarius Toney, really high-end athlete, high draft capital, electric with the ball in his hands. Wan'Dale Robinson, 2nd-round draft capital. Sterling Shepard coming off an Achilles injury. And Darius Slayton, who, is Darius Slayton. There's no more Evan Ingram to worry about at tight end. You still got Barkley, but someone's got to catch the ball here. There's major opportunity for 1 or 2 of these Giants players, and they're all going in the 10th round or later. So just food for thought when you're picking later in some of these best ball drafts and when your leagues come around at the end of August. All right, Dwain, I can't get enough. And it pains me to say this if you're watching on YouTube and you see my sweatshirt, but the CD Lamb hype for me is going to be what it was last year for everybody. When they were getting out the Jergens and the tissues, watching him do, catches with one hands in shorts at minicamp. Like CD Lamb without Amari Cooper is going to be freaking amazing this year. You got a healthy Dak. You've got a lightened receiving tree out there. You got another year older Zeke. Come on. What are we talking about here? Jalen Tolbert, CD Lamb's going to eat. He's going to be a top 5 wide receiver this year in the Bible, according to Drake.
Well, that's a good Bible. We've already talked about it on the wide receiver tiers, show. I have CD Lamb ranked number 4 in my ranks, in my wide receiver 2, the top of my second tier of wide receivers. And it's really just because he checks every box across the board for everything that we just talked about. Already has a wide receiver 3, has a wide receiver 2 finish. If you go back and you look at, his targets per route run, you look at his yards per route run, you look at his receiving grades, like he's checked every box in each one of these years. And guys that have this specific profile that check all those boxes, like it's only a matter of time. They eventually have the wide receiver 1 season. And so with CD, there have been a few guys that have tricked us. Amari Cooper's one. He never really got to that elite level. But he stayed at wide receiver 2 level. So that's the beauty of a guy like Lamb with the profile he has. Yeah, there have been a few guys that haven't gone on to take the next step. DJ Moore would be another one. And he could just be a wide receiver 2. But of all the big names that we talk about that eventually become like the guys that we want to draft, for 3-4 years in a row as a wide receiver 1, he also checks all those boxes. And so Lamb is a guy that you just absolutely have to want to get your hands around this year.
Very similarly is T. Higgins, another guy who's being drafted in the top 10, who has, like CD Lamb, who has not finished in the top 10. He's got actually a major hurdle in front of him with Jamar Chase, whereas CD Lamb does not. T. Higgins, CD Lamb, kind of the same guy, I guess, in terms of your metrics.
Yeah, and T. Higgins, you're getting, a little bit later than what you're having to do, with Lamb. So Higgins, a lot of times you're getting coming around that 2-3 turn. Sometimes he'll slide to the middle of the 3rd round. Oh man, I'm pouncing on T. Higgins when that happens, but has that wide receiver 3 and wide receiver 2 finish. The PFF, he has wide receiver 2 PFF receiving grades that back that up each of his first 2 years of 79.0 and 83.8. And like you mentioned, yeah, he's got to deal with Jamar Chase, but this is also an offense that we saw towards the end of last year take a step forward, actually start throwing the ball more. They've beefed up the offensive line. Yeah, there's 3 mouths to feed with Higgins, Jamar Chase, and Tyler Boyd. We shouldn't forget Tyler Boyd either. But at the same time, the offense itself could take a step forward. And again, remember, it's just a really great profile to be on. Higgins is eventually probably going to have a blow-up wide receiver 1 year, and it could very well be this year. Things just happen weird. He could just out-target Jamar Chase. That's in his range of outcomes. Jamar Chase could deal with an injury that could open up, more room for T. Higgins. The offense could just take a big step forward and decide to throw the ball more than what they did last year. If they just thrown the ball as much as they did, down the stretch over the whole season, T. Higgins would have already been a wide receiver 1 last year. We wouldn't even be waiting on this. It just would have already occurred. So I think there's just so many outs for Higgins. I want to draft him over Mike Evans for sure. I want to draft him over Keenan Allen. I want to draft him over all the guys that are on the wrong end of that slope where we start to see the numbers, right, wane as far as how many players can continue to put up these wide receiver 1 seasons. I would much rather be on Lamb and Higgins than those guys.
Another guy in that wide receiver 3-year tier that we're high on here at the Hustles, Michael Pittman of the Indianapolis Colts. Carson Wentz is out. Matt Ryan's in. And last year, Pittman did notch wide receiver 2 PPF receiver grades and a top 24 targets per route run grade. So, Dwain, you're on record as long as I am as kind of really being ahead of ADP on Pittman this year. He's a guy going off the board on underdog at about pick 32, 33. It's wide receiver 13. I'm in on this guy. I think he's going to have a phenomenal year. And if you can get him even later, maybe in some of your home leagues, and he's your wide receiver 2, I just can't wait to see what Michael Pittman does for people in fantasy this year.
Yeah, this is one of the players that, like last week when we were before the show, right, on tiers, and you're like, oh, we want to talk about Michael Pittman. And I'm like, well, we probably should. Like, he's one of the guys I'm the furthest over ADP on is Michael Pittman, meaning like, I think you should take him earlier than what ADP says. Another player that I would draft over Mike Evans, a player that I would draft over Keenan Allen. He's going right in the same range with those players. Now, I will say with Pittman's profile, if you look at the guys that have been similar to him, he is more likely to continue on. Like, he has a bigger range of outcomes that say he just continues on as a wide receiver 2 and doesn't become that wide receiver 1 that we see with Lamb and Higgins, that their profiles are screaming. But it's still, there's a huge chance of him being a wide receiver 1 still. He doesn't have quite the ability after the catch that you see with CD Lamb. A little more on line with T. Higgins there, but Higgins is still a little bit better. Higgins and Pittman are actually kind of similar players in certain ways. Lamb is different than the way those two play the game. Doesn't matter. We all we cares about is the fantasy finishes. But with Pittman, like you mentioned the other stuff, just playing in an offense where he's going to be absolutely locked in as a wide receiver 1. And he needs to be, because they want to run the ball first, right? So and we've talked about that in the tiers show, how you balance out those pieces of information. But the big thing for me, like, is he didn't do it as a wide receiver when he was a rookie. Like, he didn't hit the PFF receiving grades we want to see. And that's what adds the additional risk into Pittman's profile. His draft capital is very similar to T. Higgins. But I still love the upside to getting to that wide receiver 1 finish. And it could very easily happen this year with Matt Ryan. Better than Carson Wentz accuracy at every single level of the football field, whether you're facing pressure, not facing pressure, play action, you name it. Matt Ryan was better than Carson Wentz over the last 3 seasons.
I might have to take my Carson Wentz autograph off the wall and replace it then with a Matt Ryan. I have 2 Carson Wentz autographed photos in my house. One's in my son's room. I got to get those out of there. We'll see if we can get a cheap.
He'll probably kill it for you this year. Now that he's with the Commanders, he's back in the division, and he'll probably be great.
He's coming into Philly and winning that game. There's no question. A player that you wanted to talk about in this tier, and again, we're not giving you everybody. If you want to go over to pff.com and read about Jerry Jeudy and Darnell Mooney and Laviska Shenault, don't read about him. But anyways, Chase Claypool is a guy who 2 years ago was really bursting onto the scene in fantasy. Last year, kind of a down year for him. I don't think most fantasy players would say, hey, give me a wide receiver in Pittsburgh who had over 100 targets back-to-back years. And I don't think they'd come up with Chase Claypool, but he has. He just hasn't done, I guess, as much last year because he didn't score the touchdowns. He scored 9 touchdowns as a rookie, only 2 last year. That's a major swing in terms of PPR points. Who knows what's going to happen with Mitch Trubisky this year, or if they go with Kenny Pickett. But due to your metrics, Dwain, we should be keeping our eye on Chase Claypool.
Yeah, absolutely. So with Claypool, year 1, he hit wide receiver 2 thresholds for the PFF receiving grade, targets per route run, yards per route run, to back up his wide receiver 2 finish. He had scored 217 points, so he was just over the 215 threshold. He was almost a wide receiver 3. Last year, fell to wide receiver 4 territory. Was out there a little bit more. 71% of the time the Steelers passed the ball, he was in a route, only 65%, as a rookie. But whenever you look at his targets per route run, it still said that he was a wide receiver 3. His yards per route run were borderline being on the wide receiver 3 territory. So yeah, this is a player that, and the reason I love Claypool is because he's also, like Tony, just really sliding down the boards now, right? And we know that we've got quarterback questions in Pittsburgh. We know we've got a team that's going to run the ball more. So there are a lot of questions, but at the end of the day, Claypool has a profile that says he could still eventually be a wide receiver 1, could rebound to wide receiver 2. I think of him as a really like that high end wide receiver 3, or if you've just got a loaded, team, super high end wide receiver 4, right? Upside wide receiver 4 is the way you can look at him. But like that wide receiver 1 is in his range of outcomes. Even if he just gets back to wide receiver 2 or wide receiver 3 status, he's going to be a value at where he's going in ADP right now, right? With around 11, around 10, somewhere in there where he typically goes on Underdog and on FFPC.
What's interesting is take a look at some of the players that we're talking about and their Underdog ADP. There's a couple of guys here that are back-to-back, Chase Claypool and Kadarius Toney, that you can get in round 10 on Underdog. So this is why these shows are valuable. Listen and learn, and then make sure you're targeting guys like Claypool, guys like Toney, and help win your underdog league, your home league, whatever you got to do. But because that's when you're on the clock and you got to make a choice, you're sitting there going, oh, am I going to take this guy or this guy? Use the information Dwayne's giving you here and rock and roll and win some cash. Gabe Davis, we can quickly touch on. He's the last guy in this tier that we'll mention just because everyone loves talking about Gabe Davis this year. I think he's going to be everyone's hot, breakout wide receiver for 2022. What do your numbers tell you about Gabe in Buffalo?
Well, he did register a wide receiver 3 PFF receiving grade last year. And, had Gabe Davis played, the whole season, which is what we're projecting this year as a starter. And when I say starter, like seeing 80 to 85%, being on the field for 80, 85% of the passing plays. He just didn't have that until the end of the year last year. So I'm, the wide receiver 3 PFF receiving grade, in year 2, by itself is not hugely predictive. So I don't want to oversell it, but there are guys in the sample, right? Now, again, Gabe Davis's career has been shorter than some of the other guys we get to look at as we go further out. But it's enough that he needs to be in here. And this doesn't try to wait his situation, right? All this article is doing and all this data is doing is telling you who has the right underlying data and metrics, right? If you want to understand how the rest of the picture comes together, around the team environment and all those things, which are the things that are going to help Gabe Davis, you got to go just read the tiers article or go back and listen to the show from last week at the Hustle where we went through every single wide receiver tier and we talked a lot about Gabriel Davis. But in a nutshell for Gabe, 18% targets per route run doesn't meet a wide receiver 3 even threshold. But if you're on a team like Buffalo, Drake, that's going to throw the ball 65, 70%, of the time. They're pass happy in every type of game script. Could they change? Yes, they could. And you've got Brian DeBole moving on, so who knows? But most likely with Josh Allen being your quarterback, I would guess you're going to continue to throw the ball quite a bit. So now Gabe Davis, even if he doesn't improve that 18% targets per route run, which he could do, but say he doesn't, and he's just out there for 85%, of the routes in Buffalo, it's going to be really hard at this point with them not adding any significant competition for him to not finish as a low end wide receiver 3 at least, and he has the upside to be a wide receiver 2. Just based on if he got to a 21% targets per route run, if he just got to a wide receiver 3 threshold of targets per route run and got to play 80 to 85% of the snaps in the Bills offense, that alone is going to lock him into wide receiver 3, territory. Now, his underlying data points, and we did talk about this before, if you compare him, there are also a lot of busts, right? There are a lot of guys that have never gone on to do anything. So that's why Gabe Davis goes at the end, of the list, because really his situation is lifting him more than just his profile. But he does check a box that gets him onto the list.
Gabe Davis coming off the board, an underdog at wide receiver 26. He's coming off at pick 54 around guys like Allen Robinson, Juju Smith-Schuster, Bateman, Brandon Cooks. Boy, I might like Brandon Cooks and Allen Robinson over a lot of those guys, but we're going to move on to the next tier, guys going into year 4. And if you were in your bar, do this weekend, guys. You're at a bar, you're at a backyard barbecue, say, hey, Jimmy, who is bet me $10. How many wide receiver 1 seasons has AJ Brown and Terry McLaurin had combined? And the guy will go, let's see. They're both going in their 4th year. I don't know, probably 1 or 2 each. Blah, blah. The answer is 0. 0 wide receiver 1 seasons between AJ Brown and Terry McLaurin. They both fall into this tier. AJ Brown, of course, we know, moving on to my Philadelphia Eagles. We'll see if that team can throw the ball a little more this year. All indications say they'd like to, but the one-time AP Offensive Rookie of the Year is stepping into a situation with Dallas Goedert, with Devonta Smith, and you've got a running quarterback here. People are going to be hyped up to draft him, Dwayne. People are going to be excited to get to get AJ Brown on their team. Can he come through for us?
Yeah, I mean, the profile says you still just want to be betting on AJ Brown, but most of the fantasy community is. His ADP hasn't really slid that much. He's still going off, usually late 2nd, early 3rd round. Sometimes you'll see him go earlier than that. So with Brown, look, again, we hit on him last week in the tiers and we talked about all the other factors, but at the end of the day, what you mentioned to lead it off with him is the main point. For this article, it's wide receiver 2, and wide receiver 3 finishes. But his yards per route run, Drake, 2.65 and 2.49 over the last 2 years, those are wide receiver 1 marks. PFF receiving grades of 90.1 and 86.8. Those are elite wide receiver 1 territory. So it's just hard to imagine a world where no matter what circumstances AJ Brown faces, at some point, man, he doesn't just pop the top like on a league crushing wide receiver 1 season. Like, and again, there's just so many things that can happen. Like Goddard could get hurt. Devonta Smith could get hurt. Jalen Hurts could take a step forward. The Eagles could decide to throw the ball more. I mean, there's just a lot of ways with his talent profile that things could still work out, or he could just have an absolute monster, efficiency season, and stay healthy for the whole year. If he just stayed healthy for a whole year and earned, like last year in his games where he ran at least 79% of the routes, he averaged 31% target share, right, for the Titans. So there's just so many paths. And it's just a reminder that, like, even though all the circumstances around AJ Brown don't necessarily seem great this year, like, it's a wide receiver 1 overall is still in his range of outcomes, just because his talent profile is so freaking amazing. Every player that had this profile he has that checked all of these boxes, then there's only a few of them. They're really hard to find because it's actually what he's done is so elite. Like, they've all gone on to have huge wide receiver 1 seasons.
Health is going to be important. Got to play more than 13 games in Philadelphia this year.
I'm just looking at our chat room. It's lit up with there's something about hoochie mamas. I don't know what's going on. Like, the ladies have taken over the chat room. Look at them.
People enjoy coming in and hanging out. I mean, we're recording this on a Saturday morning. So, if you're up, your kids are maybe, just sitting around eating a bowl of cereal and you're scrolling YouTube and you go, hey, the hustle's on. Things are getting wild in the chat room, folks. It's why you've got to subscribe. You got to like the show and come hang out here. So, yeah, appreciate all you guys hanging out. Thanks. We see you in here. Let's move on to a guy. This is the guy, Dwain, I passed over in our show notes. And I go, nobody cares about Hunter Renfrow, right? I said, because they've got Devontae Adams out there now. You still got Waller. And you say, no, this is, I don't want to say Cooper Kupp, but this is exactly why people missed on Cooper Kupp, why they missed on Robert Woods. Look at the underlying metrics for Hunter Renfrow. Even with the addition of Devontae Adams, he can still get a wide receiver 1 season.
Yeah, I think a lot of people just dismiss Renfrow as being a player that can only earn targets when everyone else is hurt. Does that hurt him? No. That does help him, but guess why? Because he's already good. He's already good enough that when those opportunities present themselves, he can actually seize them. He can take advantage of them. Kind of like what we talked about with Amon-Ra St. Brown. There are a lot of receivers in this league that have been given that opportunity and they can never seize it. And what the data about Hunter Renfrow told us was before last year, when he almost he finished as a wide receiver 1, but using my benchmarks, he missed the 263-point threshold, which made him a wide receiver 2 in this particular, view of the way we're thinking about the data. But what his data told us very early on in his career and consistently year over year is that he could already be a wide receiver 2, potentially a wide receiver 1. So it's just a lot of folks aren't giving Hunter Renfrow any credit for being good when he actually really is. So you look at his rookie season, 76.5 PFF receiving grade. That's over the 75.0 threshold we want to see. 23% targets per route run. That's a wide receiver 2 mark. 2.09 yards per route run. That's a wide receiver 2 mark. And then he followed it up in year 2 with another wide receiver 3 grade of 75.0. And then he notched his wide receiver 2 finish last year. So a guy that had multiple data points already telling us, that, he eventually was probably going to have a really good season. And then that happened. So he makes it onto this list because he didn't technically meet the wide receiver 1 criteria last year. He was a wide receiver 2. So he's still got an opportunity to continue on as a wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3. But just remember, there is a chance he could still have that wide receiver 1 season. And where you're getting him in ADP, he's getting pushed down to the low end wide receiver 3, high end wide receiver 4 territory. He's a name that you shouldn't be afraid to click on. Because again, a lot can happen. You could have Devontae Adams Devontae Adams is getting older. He's now in that range of a career arc where it could just all of a sudden crash. Sometimes we get these examples where they just go into flames, immediately. I think Adams probably is going to be more along the career arc of an Andre Johnson, a Brandon Marshall, probably going to go ahead and put up, a couple more really good fantasy seasons, but it's in the range of outcomes already for Adams that he takes a big step back. And then Renfrow, right, when you look at his underlying profile, that's just, it stands out on his own. So there are just different ways. And remember, with Josh McDaniels, he keeps a slot receiver on the field at all times. Doesn't matter if they go to 12 personnel, which is 2 tight ends. Doesn't matter if they go to 21, which is 2 running backs, usually one of them being a fullback. Hunter Renfrow is going to get the treatment that we've seen with Wes Welker. When they would go into those sets, they would even still let Wes Welker play outside, right? You've seen that already with Jacoby Myers over the last 2 years. We saw it before that with Julian Edelman. So Hunter Renfrow, despite the fact that Devontae Adams has arrived, is going to see a career year in routes run, which will keep him in the wide receiver 3 conversation, even if, Adams comes in and gets 27% of the targets, like we know that he could. Hunter Renfrow, because he's going to pick up those additional routes, even if his targets per route run go down a little bit because of the arrival of Adams, like the routes alone could be enough to offset the fact that he's losing a few targets from a percentage standpoint to Devontae Adams.
Hunter Renfrow coming off the board, an underdog, wide receiver 41. He's pick 86. That is an 8th round pick. I bet in your home leagues later this summer, you might even be able to get him even later. So we're talking about a guy in the 8th round who potentially has wide receiver 1 within his range of outcomes. So, I mean, that's value. That's what we're trying to do here on the show. We also love answering questions in the chat room, Dwayne. This fits right into what we're talking about. Guys are asking about, is there any hope for Julio Jones this year? Julio Jones would be entering, I believe, his 12th season if he signs somewhere. There's speculation. Could he go to Green Bay? Could he go back to Atlanta? Wherever he could go. But based on your metrics here, and you, Dwayne, you talk about guys once they get over seasons 8, 9, 10. This guy would be talking about season 12. I don't want any part of Julio Jones because it's just, look at your numbers. Just think about the guy staying healthy first and foremost. It's not going to happen. Give me one of these young ascending players, not a guy on the back 9 of his career. Back 9, this guy's in the clubhouse already drinking an Arnold Palmer.
Well, he can't qualify for the data because he's already had the wide receiver 1 finish, right? So there's no way he can be a first timer. But like what the data does tell us about Julio, he has been so good. He's an exception. Because of how many wide receiver 1 marks that he's put up across the board, not just wide receiver 1 finishes. Like, dude, when you look at Julio's career, it's freaking nuts. Like how many of these things, it's like his Christmas tree is lit up with wide receiver 1 across the board, not just finishes, receiving grades, PPR per route run. I mean, targets per route run, yards per route run, everything over and over and over, all the way into year 9, year 10, a 2.60 yard per route run. Last year, even though he finished as a wide receiver 7, he still had a PFF receiving grade of 74.9. That's a wide receiver 2. Yards per route run of a 1.76. That's a wide receiver 3. So Julio, it just really depends on where he lands. If he lands on a loaded depth chart, he is a descending talent, not somebody you're going to be super excited about, but you can get him really late, right? I mean, where's Julio going right now? Drake, in drafts, probably like round 14 or 15. So I would never say never on Julio because he's kind of an exception. I don't think he's going to have a wide receiver 1 season, but I think he could still give you a wide receiver 3 season. He could surprise us with a wide receiver 2, and where he's going for ADP, I think that's fine. Not a guy, to your point, Drake, like that I'm rushing to the turnstile, to trying to get through and make sure I've got my ticket punched, for Julio Jones. But whenever he falls to the right range, he's a guy that I don't mind mixing in just because his profile has been so good. Like he matches the profiles of the Steve Smiths, the Larry Fitzgeralds, those guys and some of those guys even surprised us, with late career wide receiver 1 seasons. But I think looking at Julio as a wide receiver 3, if he lands in the right spot, would be the best way to do it. And then, just based on where he falls in ADP, you can take certain shots.
ADP on underdog, wide receiver 85 coming off the board at pick 195. So, I mean, you're looking, 16th round or so for Julio Jones. So really a free pick. But we're going to do on Tuesday night, we're going to do an FFPC draft there. They're 20 rounds now, right, Dwayne? So we'll see if Julio gets snagged.
Well, it's a redraft. So yeah, it's 20. It's always 20. But it's going to be with like some of the best names in the industry as far as like winning major fantasy dollars. And so it's going to be a tough draft. So like I'm going to have to get my game face on for sure. But yeah, it's going to be fun. Like we've got guys that have won major money over at the FFPC. So it's the hard way draft. So just the name of the draft alone should tell you the type of competition that we'll be dealing with.
I've had some big time guys in the industry slide into my DMs asking about that, looking to get in or help comment on it. So who knows? Maybe we'll have some fun there. So watch for that Tuesday night. Make sure you are subscribed to the YouTube page. Let's go quickly across to some guys in year 5. I was blown away. I can't believe DJ Moore is going into his 5th year in the NFL. Holy smokes. We can kind of combine DJ Moore and Courtland Sutton together as guys who have had wide receiver 2 finishes in some of their seasons, some solid receiving grades from PFF. We'll just see now if they can, number one, stay healthy, and Courtland Sutton has a good quarterback these days. DJ Moore, we know, does not. So between these two guys, looking at your metrics, Dwain, which one would you rather pull the trigger on?
Well, Moore, I mean, just profiles very differently. I mean, Sutton, we've had 1 wide receiver 2 finish. Moore, we've had 2 wide receiver 2 finishes, plus a wide receiver 3 just in the last 3 years alone. PFF receiving grades have also matched that. And so, I mean, like, the underlying data points are also screaming like he is good enough for the fantasy production he's putting up. But then last year, targets per route run reached a wide receiver 1 status at 25%. So, like, Moore is a type of profile, slightly under what we talked about with AJ Brown, but close. And like his profile still screams there's eventually going to be a wide receiver 1 finish. Now, like we say, eventually we've got year 5, year 6, these are kind of the last 2 years, like, to do it. Or he's just going to kind of be in that purgatory of like where Amari Cooper's been for his whole life. But Moore has done things that Amari Cooper's never done. From a targets per route run standpoint and some of these other data points, like he's actually scored higher than Amari. Courtland Sutton is similar in the fact that, to your point, he's had that wide receiver 2 finish, but we only have 1 of them. So the more of these data points you can stack up, the more likely you're eventually going to have that wide receiver 1 finish. But to your point, he gets Russell Wilson. He doesn't have Sam Darnold. And again, the point of this article, again, like in this data we're sharing, was really more about the talent profile and forgetting, just kind of setting the situation aside and just saying historically, what are the things that go into the makeup of a wide receiver 1? And so for Sutton, he does check enough boxes. And then you look at year 3, he was hurt. Only played he was only out there for like 3% of the routes, got hurt right away in week 1. And then last year was coming back from injury, didn't really have any quarterback play. So yeah, I mean, Courtland Sutton, though, also goes later than DJ Moore. So to answer your question, they're players that at ADP, I'm going to be interested in, both of them.
Another guy jumping off the page to me, Dwain, in this year 5 category is Russell Gage. I think people think Russell Gage is like 85 years old out there. Like, he's been in the league for 100 years. But he did post wide receiver 3, PFF receiving grade, and targets per route run in year 3 before even going to wide receiver 2 marks in his 4th year, which was last season. So he moves on now to Tampa. We've got Chris Godwin. Who knows if he's going to be on the PUP list to start the season. You've got Mike Evans, another year older. We don't know about Rob Gronkowski right now. So Russell Gage in a prime spot to possibly be a big-time PPR fantasy producer. And based on your metrics here, he's somebody we should really be paying attention to, who could have, I don't want to call league-winning season, but geez Louise. I mean, you get to play slot for Tom Brady, and you've got all those other things going in your favor. Like, yeah, give me some Russell Gage, baby.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and the thing that Gage does really well is he destroys man coverage. Targets per route run last year versus man, 35% of the time. And then whenever you look, so 35% of the time, Atlanta faced man coverage, his targets per route run in that situation, 35%. And then his yards per route run versus man, 2.91, also elite. And so when you look at what Tom Brady likes to do with Mike Evans, they like to keep him outside, let him try to help stretch the field. He works, deeper and intermediate. Yet Antonio Brown really working like intermediate and underneath. And then you have Godwin working intermediate and underneath. And so Gage is going to step in, and basically he'd essentially be gobbling up AB and Chris Godwin type targets. And he's already shown the ability to beat man coverage quickly in the short game and underneath, which is what Tom Brady's going to be looking for. So yeah, I think that Gage, not only does he check a lot of the boxes, from a standpoint of what we're looking for with these guys continuing, like you mentioned and outlined already, how they're continuing to get better, but just knowing that he's posted wide receiver 2 underlying data metrics last year, right? And this is a guy that you're getting as a wide receiver 4 in your fantasy drafts. Like, he is an absolute smash pick. Early in the year, I would not be surprised, Drake, if we look up and we're 4 weeks in and Russell Gage is a wide receiver 1. Will he be able to continue that? Probably not, because when Chris Godwin comes back, like, that's definitely going to hurt Gage and Mike Evans. and the ball will start to get, spread around a little more because you have three guys that can really demand targets. Gronk will probably come back as well. But I will not be surprised if we're doing the hustle on week 4 and it's kind of like, hey, our surprise, first 4 weeks in, like, oh my God, where did this come from? I think Russell Gage could very, very easily be on the list of wide receiver ones.
Russell Gage, just like Hunter Renfrow, we mentioned a few minutes ago, a round 8 pick on underdog. So maybe if you're going early, you're going to take a shot on a tight end. You're going to get a couple of running backs here. Still some really, really productive wide receivers to be had in the 8th round. That's awesome stuff there. All right, let's finally we'll move into the year 6 guys. And Kenny Galladay and Mike Williams were the 2 names that I really wanted to hit on here. Mike Williams is a guy who was exploding last year in fantasy football. People were making trades for him left and right. And he's got the quarterback. He's got the contract now. We just need him to stay healthy and stay on the field. And Big Mike Williams, in my eyes, could be a fantasy difference maker. But we just need a little more consistency. Kenny Galladay, we know Kenny Galladay is a talented guy. Look at some of the metrics you have here. He was injured in his 4th season, but he carried a wide receiver 2 receiving grade. The targets per route run, again, some of this was in Detroit with a different team, but Kenny Galladay is a talented guy. Who else is around him? New offense, maybe a little more creative. I like both of these guys. I think both could become wide receiver 2s for you on a weekly basis.
Yeah, I mean, Galladay gave you in year 2 that wide receiver 3 finish. Then he came up with a wide receiver 2 finish in year 3. Like you mentioned, year 4 got hurt. Year 5 got hurt in the preseason after moving over to the Giants, and just was never able to get anything going, with Daniel Jones. So he's a perfect example of a guy that could either rebound back to that wide receiver 3, wide receiver 2 status, which he would immediately pay off his ADP if he just does that. But we do have players that we've seen do these sort of things that he's done in the past, end up having that wide receiver 1 year. Obviously I think we would feel much more comfortable projecting a wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 finish. And at ADP, like I said, at ADP, like that's still going to be value to you. He's never really hit the one thing with Galladay. He's never hit a ton of the wide receiver 1, thresholds, even whenever he was performing as a wide receiver 2. Like he started to do it in year 4, but he was only out there for 21% of the routes due to the injury. So it's hard to give him too much credit for that year 4. But if we did, he was off to a gangbuster start. His PFF receiving grade was a 79.8, which was a wide receiver 2 mark. His targets per route run, 23%, a wide receiver 2 mark. And his yards per route run were at a 2.47, which is a wide receiver 1 mark. So, yeah, I mean, when you look at Galladay, wide receiver 1 is, if you look at that season, like it still could happen, but at a minimum, I think you're just getting value, at ADP. And I know he's getting older, but he's still within the range where, it could happen going into year 6.
He's an 11th round pick on underdog right now. He's not even the first giant coming off the board. That's Kadarius Toney. We mentioned Big Mike Williams. It's funny when you mention Galladay, who used to be a kind of a top 3 round pick in fantasy, and now Big Mike Williams, who is a top 3 pick in fantasy, but hasn't really stayed there. So people are really kind of projecting Big Mike here as an underdog ADP of 33. He's wide receiver 14 off the board. So people are really putting some hope into Big Mike here. It's like, let's stay healthy. Let's stay on the field. And I mean, if you're getting him and saying, hey, you're going to be the 14th best wide receiver off the board, like, holy moly, brother, you got to come through for us here. So I'm in. I made a big trade for Mike last year in a fantasy league. I remember we talked about it on the show. And if he can just stay healthy, get in the end zone, I'm all in. I mean, Justin Herbert, in my mind, is going to be in the MVP conversation all year long. Mike Williams, Keenan Allen, why shouldn't they be putting up wide receiver 1 numbers? So excited about Big Mike.
Yeah, the positives, we'll start with the negatives for Mike Williams. Targets per route run have been basically a wide receiver 6 grade his whole career until last year. 17%, 16%, 17%. And for a guy that was taken in like the top 8 picks of the NFL draft, like that's terrible compared to if you go compare him to every peer that's been drafted in that range, like he gets blown away. But what he did really well is PFF receiving grade in year 2 was a wide receiver 2. Year 3, wide receiver 2. Year 4 was a wide receiver 3. Last year, back up to the wide receiver 2 range. So Williams is really just won in other ways. He has also typically had to deal with Keenan Allen, who is really good, at uncovering and earning targets on his own. So I do think there still is this opportunity. When you look at last year, his targets per route run jumped to 21%, right, which really put him in that wide receiver 3 bucket. Yards per route run, we're in the wide receiver 2 bucket. So with Williams, former very high round draft pick, maybe just breaking out, coming into his his own late. There's also the opportunity that Keenan Allen, as he gets older, I mean, Keenan Allen's going into his 10th season. So again, like he could be hitting that cliff at any moment. Most likely with his archetype, he won't hit a cliff because he's really more of the underneath slot guy. They're not asking him to stretch the field or make all these big plays. He's a chain mover, right? And so Keenan Allen will probably be able to continue to do that for a couple more years, but he may not necessarily be the target hog that he has been, right? We could see that really start to level out potentially more between him and Williams. And I think there is some chance that Williams just takes a step forward and could pass, Keenan Allen in the pecking order. The other opportunity for Williams, which is actually showing up in this data, is even when he doesn't get a ton of targets, he does have an opportunity to still be a high level performer, right? Because he can just come through in other ways in the game. He's a really big target down in the end zone. He can make big plays down the field. There are just different gears that he has to his game that provide him with some additional outs on top of what like this data is already telling us.
If you guys want more information on even more players, I mean, there's guys we didn't touch on: Curtis Samuel, Tim Patrick, Isaiah McKenzie, Jacoby Myers, Hollywood Brown. There's a lot in here. We want you to go over to pff.com, use that promo code HUSTLE, save 25%, and you're going to get all Dwain's content. And going forward, man, you guys know it's fantasy season. You're going to go to your barbecues this weekend and, hey, how's the wife? How's the kids? No. You're going after your league mates and you're like, what pick do you have this year? Who do you like? I'm going to bury you. I'm going to slap you around like Jock Peterson did. So I can't wait. We're just on the tip of the iceberg here for the 2022 season, Dwain. So this was great stuff, man. A good exercise, really great work on finding this process here, man. I think you're going to get a lot of great feedback in the fantasy community from this.
Well, I appreciate that, man. I'm just thankful, man. I get to do what I love. This is stuff I would love to dig into, even if I was just working, a normal job. And so I'm very thankful. It's not lost on me that I'm really lucky to be in the situation, that I'm in. And so I do try to think about what are the things and the questions that I always had that I didn't have time, to dig into. And maybe I didn't, maybe there was really good content out there on it already. Maybe there wasn't, but like kind of my way of processing things is I got to go through the process for myself. And then hopefully by going through that and being able to share with everyone else, I'm hoping that it's a thing that just helps people learn. Like when I think of a podcast like this, yeah, we spend a lot of time breaking down players, but like to me, the early part of it, right? There's something here for everyone. Like if you just want to learn how to fish on your own and take everything we just said and boil it down, like if there was just like the key takeaways, right, at the end of this show, like, it's this: previous fantasy finishes are easy. The easiest way to find, future wide receiver 1 breakouts or wide receiver 2 breakouts is just to look at their previous fantasy points. Like, have they hit these thresholds? That's going to tell you right away. And then the next thing is, if for some reason, right, you're looking for the players that don't already have those finishes, then that's where PFF receiving grades, yards per route run, targets per route run, more efficiency-based metrics can come in and help you identify some of these players that could still break out that haven't already before. And then the last point just being that, look, like years 2 through 6 are huge. Like years 2 through 6 are huge as far as first-time breakouts for wide receiver 1s or wide receiver 2s. So hope people enjoy it. I enjoy getting to do the work. So that's a happy marriage for me.
Absolutely. Follow Dwain on Twitter at Dwain McFarland. I'm at Drake Fantasy. This Tuesday night, depending on when you watch this, but there'll be a YouTube video of it either way, Dwain competing in a huge high-stakes FFPC tournament. We're going to live stream the entire draft. And then also we're going to start to get into our underdog drafts. Use promo code HUSTLE on underdog. Your initial deposit will get doubled up to $100 by using promo code HUSTLE. Can't wait to start digging in to some of the new drafts that are coming out over on Underdog. Please make sure you're subscribing to the YouTube channel. You're leaving a 5-star review in those iTunes reviews because it does help us and it goes a long way, man. So Dwain, before we get out of here, what's your big plans for Memorial Day weekend?
Yeah, so we're going to, I have 2 things today. I have a buddy who his dad is turning 80, so going to a surprise party for that.
Not a surprise anymore. I think the guy subscribes to the channel.
Oh boy, that would be terrible. But then after that, going over to another buddy of mine, actually a league mate, a fantasy league mate. There'll be a couple of other probably league mates over there as well, to just do some barbecue, hang out by the pool, just have a few adult beverages, and just have a good time. And then tomorrow, we are going to see the new Top Gun from a nostalgia perspective, and we're making all of our kids go with us. And then Monday, Drake, I'll be working on I got a new shed, man. Amanda's dad
shed?
No, it's not a she shed. Like this is I want to get all these tools out of my garage, to be honest. Like, and just create more room. Like we park both of our cars in there, but it's kind of packed. Like, and we have good space in our garage, but you know how it is. Like you just take up whatever space you have, when you have like the ping pong tables and you got, 2 lawnmowers out there, the weed eaters, all that kind of stuff. So, man, going to be Monday will be more of a go touch some grass kind of day, I guess, or get your hand in the dirt.
Hand in the dirt kind of day.
Hand in the dirt. But yeah, man, I'm looking forward to it. So how about you?
I've got my nephew's 16th birthday. I can't believe. Happy birthday, Anthony. He's going to be he's a football player, and I got him a lacrosse stick this year, so we'll be celebrating that. Got to cut the grass, got the in-laws coming up, and then next week, I just bought the tickets yesterday. Going to go see Paul McCartney playing here in Syracuse at the now JMA Wireless Dome, no longer the Carrier Dome.
He was just here. I missed him, but man, definitely somebody that I want to see, because you just don't know how many more opportunities you're going to get to see someone like that.
That's what my wife said. We took the kids to see Ringo a few years ago in Philadelphia, and my wife's a huge Beatles fan, and her parents came up. McCartney played in Syracuse like 3 years ago at the Dome, so they went, and I stayed home and watched the kids, and I kind of regretted it. And now she's like, we got to take the kids. Who knows until McCartney dies? The guy's like 80. So I'm like, I'm not paying $250 a ticket. There's just no way I'm dropping over $1,000 to see Paul McCartney play. I'll watch the shit on YouTube. So we waited, and I went on one of these, third-party apps, and I found some much cheaper tickets. I had to find 6 tickets in a row and that weren't in the upper deck because my father-in-law won't sit in the upper deck. So found them. We're going to the Dome. If you want to, start a GoFundMe to help pay for these things, please go ahead, everybody. But that should be a really good time. And I got some Sierra Nevada summer breaks on ice ready for as soon as we get done with this show, and I'll be rocking and rolling.
I got some. So I've been rocking. I went to Cancun, and so there, like the big drink, like if you order a beer, like at the pool, like they want to get you a chilada, which is, it's whatever. It can be a Dos Equis, Modelo, whatever your favorite, kind of beer is. But then like, man, they just load them up with lime, like, and it's that simple. And then just a little bit of salt, like, so they're dressed. Man, so now like we got back and Modelo actually has a chilada in a can. So my wife found them like 2 weeks ago. And man, I get back there and I'm doing some yard work. I'll plow through like 6 or 7 of those in a heartbeat, Drake. They go down so easy. So yeah, my wife went by and grabbed a 12-pack of chiladas for the weekend.
Look at that. It's only like 69 out here today. I still got the cover on my pool. We're really getting off into the weeds.
We're in the 90s now here. Earlier this week, we were in the 70s, which was awesome. So it was probably our last little cool off. Now, I think today's going to be like 92 or 93, something like that.
Dwayne will always text me throughout the week random photos of like he's in a yard killing a snake or he's cutting down a tree or doing something like this. So I know he is a man about the yard work. And
I do love the yard work.
Me too.
It's very therapeutic to me.
Put the headphones in. I listen to some fantasy podcasts.
Yep.
That's how
I have one in. And then the other one, like usually if I'm working, like, not on like a mower. If I'm on a mower, I have both, obviously, because it's loud. But like if I'm not on the mower, my favorite is to have one in, the other ear open, can hear the birds and everybody, like just hear nature going on. And like you're just, getting your hand in the dirt, Drake. It's good for you. Good for the soul.
There we go. Awesome, folks. Well, thanks for hanging out with us. Have a great Memorial Day weekend, everybody. And we'll be back rocking and rolling Tuesday with an FFPC draft. If you're listening on the podcast, I don't think we're going to stream that as a podcast. It might be a YouTube exclusive. So just make sure you're getting over that YouTube channel. We keep beating you over the head with it, folks. Just do it. It's free. So for Dwayne, I'm Drake. Remember to never get out hustled. Enjoy your holiday weekend, folks.